Every farmer knows a strong season starts long before the planter rolls. At Landis, our agronomists are here to help you choose the right seed for your fields and protect it with acre-edge seed treatments that give your crop a stronger, healthier start. And with flexible financing options, it's easier than ever to plan ahead, manage cash flow, and capture early season savings. Talk with your local Landis agronomist today and plant with confidence.
This episode is brought to you by Nespresso. Gift magical mornings with Nespresso Virtuo Pop. Compact and stylish, Virtuo Pop is made to meet every morning coffee craving. From espresso to coffee, hot or iced, at the click of a button. And celebrate the season with Nespresso's limited edition coffee flavors. Sweet almond and hibiscus, cinnamon and candied tamarind, and festive double espresso. Magic in the making. Shop the holiday gift collection exclusively at Nespresso.com.
Welcome to Farm Here Daily, a Field Forward podcast. I'm your host, David Geiger. Today on Farm Here Daily, continuing coverage of the Iowa Farm Bureau annual meeting, we chat with Shawn Richmond about the latest progress of conservation practices in the state. Please be sure to like and follow the podcast as well as our social media at Field Forward Pod. We would love to have you join our community, keeping folks informed about what is affecting our farmers. This is Farm Here Daily. And joining me on Farm Here Daily, we are still at the Iowa Farm Bureau annual meeting. And to talk about some of the things going on here in conservation, I have with me Shawn Richmond. He is the Conservation and Natural Resources Policy Advisor with the Iowa Farm Bureau Federation. Shawn, thank you so much for joining me on Farm Here Daily. And let's just start off with the conservation topic. How important has that been this year, 2025, here at this annual meeting?
You know, it's a big topic every year, now as much as any time. When we have a lot of our members that are facing tough economic times on the farming side of things and trying to do conservation along with that, it's always an important topic on how we make sure that we have the resources to enable our members to continue those good efforts while continuing to be profitable and sustainable in their operations. So yeah, it's a huge topic and it's incredibly important.
I'm glad you mentioned that because this is going to be a tougher time, especially for folks who have a lot of corn acres. Corn has not been quite as profitable. And so it might be, for folks not within the conservation world, it might be something at top of mind of, well, conservation might be cut. But there's a lot of changes that we've had over the last decade in terms of what we know about conservation, what it can do for our farms and our soil, that may not be the case, or are we going to see a potential decline? What are your thoughts as you look at tougher economic times when dealing with this?
I think what we've seen over time is certainly a trend towards more conservation because a lot of that goes hand in hand with profitability and sustainability. A lot of those practices that help improve soil health are improving the bottom line while achieving the conservation outcomes that we want with reduced soil erosion, reducing our nutrient losses. So a lot of that goes hand in hand and really can help improve the bottom line of an operation, finding ways that we can make the resources available to farmers to help them, learn about those practices like things from cover crops to reduce tillage to nutrient management and all types of edge of field practices and new technologies that are available. That all takes time for them to learn those things, to help adopt them, to incorporate them into their systems and make them work. Cost opportunities have been incredibly important in helping to support farmers as they adopt those technologies, making sure that, as they're learning those, that there's that support system there with the technical and financial resources alike to help ensure their success. And so, but long term, I think what we have seen, and we are seeing in several different places where they're measuring the conservation efforts, is that we continue to grow those every day. We're seeing more acres of cover crops, more practices year after year. Despite some of these up and down economic times that farmers have been through, we do continue to see that trend of increasing conservation year over year. So it tells me that they're finding the ways to make that work. They're making it profitable. They're making it work in their systems. And overall, it has become a systems approach that they've really adopted and taken a hold of.
It is 2025. We're nearing the end of the year, getting ready to start 2026. What do we know of some of those numbers you mentioned in terms of uptick? What are some of the successes we've seen here in terms of some of the conservation practices in the state?
Yeah, so I mean, one of the big ones we talk about a lot, or you hear about a lot, is cover crops, where that practice is at. Some of the estimates are that back in 2009ish, 2010, we probably had less than 10,000 acres of cover crops in the state of Iowa. Some of the really recent robust survey work that's been going on for 6 or 7 years now shows that the most recent crop year there was about 3.8 million, or just a little bit over 3.8 million acres of cover crops planted across the entire state. So that's huge percentage growth, huge growth across the state. Again, with a practice that is much like our crops, it's dependent on the weather, how successful it's going to be, depending on the fall, if we have good germination conditions, good temperatures, good moisture. But people are finding out a way to make that work. We're seeing continued growth in several other areas too. Where it used to be called conventional tillage would have been the full tillage, where, kind of turning things black. That's no longer the convention, and it hasn't been for a while. The majority of tillage types in this state are reduced tillage, either conservation tillage, where we're leaving at least 30% residue cover, or no-till. So that has become the new convention, is to really have a much reduced tillage system that helps reduce that soil disturbance, reduce erosion. These are all things that, get adopted across millions of acres. It takes time, obviously. It takes equipment changes, ways that people can make that incorporate into their system. Iowa leads the nation in several conservation practices, thanks to the efforts of farmers over several decades. We lead the nation in things like terraces and waterways and saturated buffers and wetlands. And that's no small feat to be the state, area-wise, smaller than many other states, but the Iowa farmers here have done more of those conservation practices than anywhere else in the nation. So that really shows to me that they've really embraced that approach, and it's not going away. It's just continuing to grow.
You said we have the best in the nation so far, and all that's voluntary. Is that right?
Yeah, that's correct. Most of that's, voluntary. Some of those things you could say are kind of quasi, where it's, a choice of practice to help, with compliance on highly erodible lands and things like that. If you want to be eligible, continue to be eligible for farm program payments, things like conservation compliance are required. But those are always done in a manner where it's voluntary about what the producers choose to elect to help them meet the needs and the terms of those conditions. Things especially around highly erodible lands, like implementing terraces, grass waterways, reduced tillage. That provides a flexible mechanism for farmers to figure out what works best for their operation in order to achieve their needs, and along with the needs that are desired for the conservation outcomes.
You mentioned that there's an aspect of this that takes a long time. In terms of conservation, it takes a while to see the effects of conservation, but it also takes a while to have folks work out what conservation practices work on their lands in the best and most effective ways. And you can't just throw all of that on all of your acres. You have to slowly move it across your farm if that's a way you want to do it. So as you look at ways to make it more viable for someone trying to do it long term, stability is also a factor. What are some of the postures and some of the ways folks have tried to make this a stable situation for farmers who not only want to try it, but want to continue trying and expanding it?
So as far as programs and resources, we're very fortunate here in Iowa and elsewhere as well. Through both federal and state and local initiatives, there's quite a bit of resources that have been made available. Our Governor Kim Reynolds, one of her first acts was to sign into law, dedicated long-term funding to help farmers with assistance for water quality and conservation practices. That's been extended out several years through 2039, I believe. And so that is a long-term dedicated resource that we need to have that stability and that foundation to provide the cost share and the technical assistance that producers need to enable them to adopt this work. Similarly, on the federal side, we have several programs and practices, things like the Regional Conservation Partnership Program through NRCS, some of your standard programs like Conservation Reserve Program from the Farm Service Agency, several other resources that that sometimes it can kind of seem like there's so much out there it's hard to be aware of all of it. It's a good problem to have. We're kind of a blessing of riches here, or an embarrassment of riches to some extent. With the number of resources that are available out there. They're not everywhere, though. Some of those practices are very targeted, obviously, and not every practice works everywhere. And so that's part of the learning journey for farmers is, what's your topography like? Are you kind of north central Iowa where it's more gently sloping or flatter lands, or are you more highly erodible lands, steeply sloping? You're going to need different practices to address different resource concerns depending on where you're at, depending on what your soils are like, depending on what your weather's like. So it's not the expectation that everybody tries to do everything on every acre. It's finding out what works on your acre the best and is easy to implement, and works for your bottom line.
Now, you and I have known each other for quite a while. For folks listening in, I actually worked with Shawn a decade or so ago, and we've spoken before on many of these topics. And I remember learning from you guys about just the diversity of soils, and I had not quite seen that before. I had not heard that idea. We have so many different types of soils that not every practice is going to work. Not every cover crop is going to work, and it's very difficult to determine which one will work. So it requires a little bit of experimentation. How, 10 years down the line, how do we recommend folks experiment with conservation, cover crops, all these different practices?
I always recommend folks that, to reach out to, first start with who's that good technical resource? The USDA service centers are in every county. We have great contacts and resources through the Iowa Department of Agriculture and Land Stewardship. There's so many conservation professionals out there and watershed projects that are going on where that's a great place to start. But when you're driving down the road in your neck of the woods, looking at somebody that's doing something, go talk to them. Go talk to that neighbor, your farmer that's doing something. Ask them what it is, how it works, how they made it work in their system. We have a great peer network of farmers. That's a lot of that type of learning that goes on across the landscape, and that's been the intention of several of the watershed projects that have been set up in this state. As we started to really implement our nutrient reduction strategy, was starting at that watershed basis, providing funds and resources really as local hubs to demonstrate the technologies that are available, how they work, where they work, and why, what the results are, and having those local hubs where then, we can have the farmer-to-farmer learning that goes on, which is so great in this state. We have so many people that are so willing to collaborate on conservation, share their missteps, as painful as they might have been, so that somebody else doesn't make the same mistake that they did, and learn from that, so we can all be successful in this endeavor in adopting conservation.
What would be an example of that? I think of when things first started rolling, especially with cover crops, there were sudden realizations of winter kill and what actually was killed off and what needed termination after winter as a hurdle some of the first cover crop triers had. Are there other examples?
It's a good one. Certainly, a lot of the recommendations that I've heard, is for somebody, first starting out, maybe think about something that's going to winter kill, like an oak cover crop that you don't have to worry about coming back in the spring and terminating. That could potentially get into a hairy situation, especially when you're, staring down planting within weeks of you need to terminate that cover crop until you really kind of got the system figured out where you're used to going out, getting a good stand of cover crop established in the fall and being able to be ready to come back and actively manage it in the spring. So certainly there's lots of people that have, willing, intentionally or not, made those mistakes or had those experiences. We don't want people, trying something, having a bad experience and walking away from it forever. We want to have that network of people out there that can help them learn from that, help support them, and help them come back to try that again until they can figure it out. There's certainly a lot of factors that go into that. Cover crops in particular, it's more helpful if you've got, some livestock in the system where you can build some of that value back in. But there's a lot of other practices too that, similarly, it's a great learning opportunity. Some of them is just, learning what it is, something that's maybe not as prevalent as a grassed waterway or as a terrace. Most every farmer in the state knows what those are. I've been very familiar with those. It's a long-standing generational practice that we see all across the state. Newer practices like water quality wetlands, saturated buffers. Some people, not everybody, probably knows what all those are. And so as you have an opportunity to get out and hear about those, learn about them, that's a big part of it as well. Just, learning about the new technologies that are available, how they work, where they go. So really it's just a learning opportunity that I encourage people to go out and explore those new opportunities and learn more about it, and along with what the resources are available for it.
Shawn, you were very involved with the Iowa nutrient reduction strategy when that first started rolling out. What is the state of our efforts to reduce nutrients in waterways, which is a key piece of why we have seen a big push for conservation practices?
Yeah, so I mean, it's we've seen great success with implementing the nutrient strategy. That was first came about in 2013. So we've had some time and some funding and some resources become available. We're in a better place now than we have ever been. We had the Department of Agriculture is setting records year after year with conservation funding and conservation getting put on the ground out the door. And we're seeing that show up in the intended results and what we want to see, especially on phosphorus. That's been an effort that, we've really focused on reducing erosion for quite a bit longer time, going back to the area of the Dust Bowl. But that's really borne fruit. Through those voluntary practices, through the technologies that we've created and seen adopted across wide acreage, millions of acres across the state. On the phosphorus side, our goal in the nutrient strategy was overall a 45% reduction that was shared between agriculture and point sources. For agriculture's cut of that, the expectation and the goal was that we would see around a 30% reduction, 29% reduction achieved by agriculture. We've actually exceeded that at this point by the estimates we see from the science on the practices that have been adopted and what we'd expect those to produce as far as results. It's over a 30% reduction, and we're continuing to add to that year after year. So we've seen great progress. We've seen one of the goals met. As far as agriculture goes, obviously the point source side of the equation is continuing to come along too. We're seeing a lot of great progress there. That's been one of the really great, most best outcomes of the nutrient strategy, I think, is this collaborative approach between agriculture and urban, point and non-point sources working towards these same goals. Those are coming along very well. Nitrogen moves differently. It's a different story there. Some of the practices that we have for that, where phosphorus mainly moves with the soil across the surface, nitrogen moves through the soil, attached to water, and kind of comes through. So it takes a different practice to address that and different technologies. I wish they all worked the same as well as they did for phosphorus as they do for nitrogen. But the fact is, we're continuing to discover ones. Some of the practices that are really becoming ramped up today didn't even exist when we started the nutrient strategies, such as saturated buffers, oxbow wetland restorations. Those were things where we didn't either even have an idea of that as a new technology or something that was vetted out to the point where we understood what we could expect as far as results. So, there is admittedly more work to be done, especially on the nitrogen side of the equation, but we are continually seeing year over year ramping up in those efforts with several of those new practices. And so the adoption levels are really promising to where it looks like we're continuing to make a lot of progress.
I think that's really incredible to look at something that's been around for 12 years now and seeing some measurements and goals being met. Still, there are folks outside of the agriculture space and some within it that think it's not moving fast enough. What is your thoughts on either ways to speed this up or ways to temper expectations to this is a really good pace we're going at or not?
I think it's, we're, to some extent, especially, we're kind of, at the limit of technology here. The technologies we have available and the areas that we can implement those on is kind of some of the things that are going to be the sideboards we have to operate within here. Certainly I have heard those, that are of the mindset that things aren't happening fast enough, and, that's, subjective. That's, people are welcome to their opinions on that. I've worked in this space my entire career, nearly 30 years at this point. I think we're making tremendous progress at a great pace. Looking at the way that we're scaling up, the rate of scaling up, especially with newer technologies, it's very promising. But as far as setting expectations, it is a generational approach. We knew that when we were creating the nutrient reduction strategy. This is not an overnight solution. We don't have, it wasn't an overnight issue either that came into existence. So it's not going to be an overnight solution to get to the goal line on this. So it is going to take it's going to be a decadal approach as we continue to implement technologies and practices, gain traction, gain momentum. But all signs point to that is where we're at. We're seeing year-over-year increases in adoption of practices. We're seeing our farmers in this state set records for the amount of conservation put on the ground year after year. They're leading the entire nation in so many things and practices in conservation. So, I guess I'm a glass half full kind of guy, which is much more optimistic, but, that's based off of the experience I've had and seeing what farmers can do when they put their minds to it.
To conclude the conversation, I want to go over what you find to be the most exciting research or technology that folks are looking into in the space of conservation. What are you really interested in seeing here as we move forward? Or maybe it is recent research or technology that has come out that you are excited about.
You know, and I'll just have to admit I'm probably a little biased on this one because I started out my career at Iowa State University in the Iowa Department of Agriculture working on water quality wetlands. But I would say generally speaking, you know, and that continues to be a really promising practice. But just, you know, broadening out beyond that, though, some of the things that I see is offering some of the most hope, you know, more focused on the nitrogen side where we do need, you know, more work, more technology is available to help us advance. I like the structural practices. I guess I'm a little biased that way, you know, something that can treat a large area while having a relatively small footprint, things like water quality wetlands, saturated buffers, bioreactors even. Technologies that are easy to implement into the existing system we have without taking, you know, land out of production or hopefully a very minimal footprint, you know, because I've worked at the forefront of agriculture and the environment my entire career, and that's always been done in the vein of finding ways that we can sustain and improve productivity alongside achieving the conservation goals that we have. And so that's really much the vein that I look for the technologies, things that are widely implementable, easy to implement. They scale. They provide a big bang for the buck in terms of, you know, reducing nutrient losses. And there's a lot of good work happening out there with that. Saturated buffers I'm really excited about as one that could be something essentially where we have the ability maybe to go in and retrofit some of these systems. A lot of these areas that really aren't even under production anyway along these streams to begin with, so minimally invasive. There's newer technology looking at applying that same concept to grass waterways. That's really exciting to me because when we look at the amount of grassed waterways we have in this state, it's nearly, I believe, 80,000 miles. And so we have more miles of grassed waterways, I believe, than what we do of, you know, streams, even, or maybe it's terraces, one or the other. But you know, it's a practice that's been widely implemented, and so there's a lot of great opportunity that shows us there's places where there's conservation already been put in place. If we can go back in and maybe add a little more value to that on the water quality side, it's a great place to start with minimal cost and being minimally invasive while having a big impact.
Shawn Richmond is with the Iowa Farm Bureau here at the annual meeting. Shawn is the Conservation and Natural Resources Policy Advisor with the Iowa Farm Bureau. Thank you so much for joining us on Farm Your Daily.
Yeah, you bet. Thank you.
This is Farm Your Daily, a Field Forward podcast. Thank you so much for listening. Again, in order to continue to produce this type of local content, we would love to have you join our community. So please follow the podcast as well as our social media channels at Field Forward Pod. You can also find me on social media at Geiger Reports. Again, I am your host, David Geiger, and I'll be back again tomorrow, everybody.